Okay, well, welcome everyone. I hope you can hear me and see me. My name is John Delury. I'm a professor here at Yonsei University, the Graduate School of International Studies in Seoul, South Korea. And on behalf of Yonsei, the Program of International Cooperation, and on behalf of the embassies of Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Sweden, we want to welcome you to our dialogue today on Nordic peace mediation and the Korean conflict. There's over 300 people who have signed up, and there could be more of you joining. Diplomats, students, journalists, citizens from around Korea and around the world. We're just delighted at the interest that our program has generated. And we think to some extent we've found a good combination here of Nordic and Korean. And so we'll do our best to make it informative. Originally, our discussion was going to be done actually in person, a rare thing, at the residence of the Swedish ambassador and good friend, Jacob Hallgren, who is himself a distinguished expert in peace and conflict studies. So just wanted to acknowledge him and thank him. But in light of the situation here with Seoul City moving up the level, we decided together that it was better due to the COVID situation to move entirely online. We think we're demonstrating one of the Nordic peace mediation virtues of flexibility, and so we adjusted our program. Nordic societies, of course, also champion public participation and inclusivity. And so we really want to encourage you to use the chat function on YouTube to ask your questions. And I promise as moderator, I'll do my best, we'll do our best to bring those questions to our panel of experts. So speaking of things Nordic and Nordic peace mediation, we're incredibly fortunate and truly honored to be joined at the beginning of our program to welcome a guest speaker who is zooming in from Oslo and needs really no introduction. You probably saw her recently. I saw recently as she announced the Nobel Peace Prize Award for this year, Berit Reiss-Andersen, who's the chair of the Norwegian Nobel Committee, which of course awards the Nobel Prize. And so without further ado, I want to turn the YouTube over to her, and she will share some remarks with us for about 15 minutes on Nordic peace mediation from her perspective. So welcome to you.
Thank you very much, John, for your kind introduction. And thank you all for this opportunity to speak directly to Korea on this very sad anniversary that we are commemorating today. 70 years of a warlike situation, a warlike conflict, is no celebration. Actually, I will not really speak about the conflict on the Korean Peninsula, nor will I speak specifically about Nordic peace mediation. I will speak to you from the perspective of the Nobel Peace Prize. We do not create peace. We award champions of peace. And before I continue, I would just say a few words about the Peace Prize itself, created by the Swedish citizen Alfred Nobel. He was an inventor, a cosmopolitan, and extraordinary wealthy. When he died, he made a will where he donated his entire fortune to a foundation to be responsible for awarding 5 Nobel Prizes, one of them peace. And the Peace Prize, contrary to the other prizes, were to be awarded by a committee in Oslo. The other prizes belong in Stockholm. Now, I will take you super quickly through the terms of the will. The will awards peace, taking place in 3 forms. Now, the basic attribute that has to be met is that it is a significant contribution to the benefit of human mankind. And peace has to promote one of three alternatives, or all three for that matter: fraternity among nations. And nations also have been interpreted to fraternity among peoples. That's one. And the second term is reducing standing armies. Now, that was a term that could be met at the time when the will was created in 1896. We don't, to a very large extent, have standing armies anymore, but it is the disarmament term. And the third criteria is contributing to peace congresses. Peace congresses were very much in mode in the 1870s, 1880s. It has been interpreted to a term where institutions contribute significantly to peace. So what I'd like to speak about very shortly is how do we in the Norwegian Nobel Committee really understand these terms. We award peacemakers and the aspirations to peace. And I would say, in addition to these terms, there are some principles to be applied to create peace. One is that one or more parties have to actually change their position. If you want to make a transition from war or conflict, you have to change your position. Now, you will also not only have to change your position, you will have to change your perspective. And the third principle that I will highlight is that in most cases, you also need the support from more than only the parties, but also from institutions. Now, these are principles. They are better explained if you apply them to historical events. And I have focused on some peace prizes from our recent history and peace prizes that actually somehow address divided nations or peoples. There is the relevance to the Korean Peninsula. And let's go immediately to a very troubled area where peace has not been actually created, but a peace prize was awarded in 1994 to the Middle East situation, Israel and the Palestinian conflict, awarded to three individuals, Yasser Arafat, Menachem Begin, and Shimon Peres. I would say this was a peace prize for an effort. The peace process was not successful. What it highlighted was an enormous divide by the two parties of interest, Israel and the Palestinian people, where a dialogue was in fact established. And I am confident that when peace in this troubled area someday will be created in the future, it will be a very important element of dialogue and seeing the perspectives of the different peoples. It can also be mentioned that this process was supported by exactly a Nordic peace mediation process, the Oslo dialogue. And I think what we can see is that communication is the key point. And it sounds so easy, but in this case, where a declared terrorist organization, the PLO, actually went into dialogue with Israeli politicians, it was an enormous step that I'm confident will be part of the future peace process. A more successful peace process of divided people is the Northern Ireland conflict, where the conflict was so deep that they didn't even agree on which people they were divided from, United Kingdom or Ireland. As you know, this is a very long and complicated story, and the Peace Prize was finally awarded to John Hume and David Trimble for their contribution and being in the heart of the peace process of creating peace by finally signing the Good Friday Agreement. Now, the troubled areas of Northern Ireland is still troubled, but the troubles, as they refer to it, is a situation of the past, even though the Brexit situation has added new tension. Also here, there was John Hume was a Catholic social democrat. David Trimble was a Protestant from the Unionist Party, and that in itself, creating a dialogue by the political, over the political and religious divide was significant. But perhaps even more was the dialogue with the IRA, again, a terrorist organization that was not awarded part of the Peace Prize award, but definitely part of the dialogue. I would also like to mention, going back even a few more years in time, a very significant division in our recent history is, of course, South Africa and the apartheid policy, a division among peoples of one nation. As you are all aware of, Nelson Mandela was awarded the Peace Prize in 1993, and he is a global hero. But he actually shared the prize with Frederick de Klerk, who was the symbol and the representation of apartheid in South Africa. So why was he awarded the prize? Wasn't he really the cause and the reason for the troubles? This is a very significant example of the principle of changing your position. When he actually released Nelson Mandela from prison and immediately started a political dialogue with him on the transition, he changed a position that probably protected South Africa from a civil war. And of course, I cannot have this introduction without mentioning the Peace Prize of 20 years ago to the Korean Prime Minister Kim Da-young and the Sunshine Policy, right in the core, perhaps, of what you will be discussing today. It is a prize that highlights the principle of trying to see the perspective of the other. Establishing a dialogue is exactly about that. But it is also a prize that highlights the failure of language in itself and a dialogue not being enough. It has to somehow be supported by more hardcore politics. And it has to be on both sides, and it has to be supported, perhaps here, by institutions. And a strong Peace Prize institution is, of course, the United Nations, that has been awarded peace prizes in so many representations. And I would also say, speaking about the Korean Peninsula, one cannot avoid speaking about nuclear weapons. And I will remind you that as a peace prize institution I represent, nuclear weapons is very much in our focus, and we have awarded several prizes to this purpose. Last but not least, ICAN in 2017. And also to highlight institutions, I would like to mention Germany. The division all known to you and the reunification in 1990. Several Peace Prize awards played a role. Willy Brandt, of course, for upholding through the Cold War the dialogue to the communist regime of East Germany. Mikhail Gorbachev for being the person who perhaps triggered the fall of the USSR and the consequences of it, and finally the fall of the wall. But a very supported institution in this perspective is actually the European Union, who was awarded the Peace Prize for 2012, not for its commercial efforts, its economical efforts, but bringing together several nations in Europe, and most significant, the arch enemies of Europe, Germany and France, in a cooperation to the benefit of day-to-day politics and trade. This is really a very good example of an institution promoting peace. In this short time, I have only been able to give a very quick overview, and perhaps a little bit too superficial overview, to the principles of the Peace Prize. And what I have mentioned in so many examples is the importance of dialogue and changing your perspective. I will close with a little story connected to the Peace Prize, to Colombia and other divided people. President Santos was awarded the Peace Prize in 2016 for his efforts to end the civil war that had lasted in 50 years in Colombia. Now, the story I want to tell you is we have several examples in peace efforts of a structured dialogue, like the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions of South Africa that were initiated by Desmond Tutu, also a Peace Prize winner. But in Colombia, they brought that to a different level, because as the Colombian authorities were negotiating with FARC in Havana, as part of the peace negotiations, they flew in victims from both sides, victims of FARC atrocities, victims of the state militia atrocities, and the victims entered the room, told their stories to the peace negotiators and the politicians on both sides. And we have been told that it was so strong emotions that the hardcore militias, FARC guerrillas, politicians sat there crying, listening to the stories of the victims. It shows the power of the spoken word, the story, the dialogue, and human emotions. And what does it bring to peace? It sees a new perspective of the war and the conflict, and that is the human suffering. That is the greatest inspiration to create peace. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you so much. Folks in our group are clapping, and I think there's at least 300 people on YouTube joining them. That was really, it's such a rare opportunity to hear the lessons of each one of those half dozen cases are inordinately complex. And Berit Reiss-Andersen is able to distill from those principles that we can then use in our own discussion. Because I think one thing we can say about the Korean conflict, as you mentioned at the beginning, it's one of the oldest, you know, it's one of the intractable ones that's gone on for 70 years. And so the need to step out and find new perspective of the kind that you gave us is really incredibly important to what we're trying to do. And so with that, I want to segue to our panel of experts who are focused on various dimensions, and we've quite deliberately picked a wide range of expertise and perspectives to have a kind of holistic approach to this topic, to this discussion. And I think we can actually segue first using the point that Berit Reiss-Andersen made about 2 points about dialogue, about the fact that you have to start with dialogue, even with those, well, especially with those who are the enemy. That's how peace works. So that readiness for dialogue, but that also the dialogue has to be premised on a willingness to change. And so Kyung-Soo Lee, you're our leading North Korea expert here. And I want to get started with you with one of the toughest questions. There are always so many questions about North Korea and the leadership in Kim Jong-un and what do they want. But for our conversation, I want to start with, on the question of peace, what is your view? Is Kim Jong-un a partner who can be serious about peacemaking and peace building, and on what conditions? Could you get our conversation started with that?
This is Kyung-Soo Lee. I'm a researcher of North Korean studies. So as John mentioned, North Korea have a nuclear weapon and have conducted 6 times of nuclear tests and 18 times of missile tests. So nuclear state and a peace. When you think of North Korea in 2 dimensions, it is a little bit oxymoron. But I think if we think the nuclear of North Korean nuclear weapons as a means to achieve a certain goal, in this case, peace in Korean Peninsula, we have good reason to talk North Korean peace. It's my views. So for North Korea, many think that regime survival was the utmost goal for North Korea leaders for several decades. That doesn't change at all, still present. But if having a nuclear weapon can improve regime survival, but in other sense, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, current leadership, also think about his people as well. North Korean people do know that they are isolated from the world and their country is very poor compared to South Korea. I met many defectors living in South Korea as a project, so they truly know this simple fact when they were in North Korea and make a decent living by themselves from remuneration from North Koreans in South Korea. I would say defectors. North Korean defectors in South Korea send much money to North Korea families and relatives. So they do know their country has a problem in international standard. And Kim has to satisfy these North Korean people that his reign is legitimate and people can be better off in near future. In this sense, I think we can talk about performance legitimacy in China, that one party rule has merits in terms of economic growth and increase in people's well-being. Basically, although having a nuclear weapon has meaning to regime survival, current Kim Jong-un has to make ordinary people's lives better for his legitimacy. In fact, in this sense, peace in North Korea or North Korea denuclearization has a meaning to North Korean leadership as well, I think. In fact, peace in Korean Peninsula is codified in summit statement of Kim Jong-un and Moon Jae-in, and also of Kim and Trump. You may recall the Singapore Summit Declaration talks of the PRK and US new relations between the PRK and US, and lasting and stable peace regime on Korean Peninsula, and complete denuclearization for goals for both countries. It was 1.5 years ago. But we Koreans know that we have not started to achieve peace yet. Why? Only the joint statements, then no further progress in following Hanoi summit. The three goals are interconnected. The three goals of new relations and peace regime and denuclearizations are interconnected. And in that new relations and peace regime is impossible without abandoning for the North Korea the nukes they have now. If we and I personally suppose that North Korea's ultimate goal is normalization between United States and peace regime, so he can put limited resources in the economy for his performance to increase his performance legitimacy. The peace process in the early 28 last and 2 years ago is a proof, is an achievement itself that it is the first summit meeting of United States and the PRK. It is an important start of dialogue and maybe changing positions. And Koreans, both North and South Koreans, including myself, have expectations for considerable changes in the peninsula, but not yet. We are near the start of peace process. If we recall 2 years ago, South Korea has a very important role in starting a dialogue and South Korea do act as a negotiator or a facilitator at that time, but the Hanoi no deal leaves little room for South Korea to act as one between the two parties' dialogue. You probably remember the North Korea delegation in Pyeongchang Olympics and Panmunjom Summit and following Singapore Summit. Of course, and after that, Hanoi no deal. If we recall the dramatic 6 months, South Koreans changing position or perspective do impacted current peace process, in my opinion. Moon Jae-in invited North Korea to partake in Pyeongchang Olympics in exchange for suspension of joint military training of South Korea and United States. He first acted to talk about the suspension, and then North Korea responded, and then Trump responded as well. It's the start of the dramatic dialogue, as I remember. And but unfortunately, after the Hanoi no deal, and of course, US sanctions, elections and international sanctions prevented Moon to act as a negotiator. After that, he sought to link railways between the two Koreas, but without result, because no metals or electronic gears cannot be installed in North Korea under the sanction regime. Even humanitarian assistance has to be approved, has to get an approval from sanction committee, which took a quiet time to get into the people in need, North Korean people in need, like food or nutrition. And in the COVID situation, about and the COVID situation related materials. Now, under the Biden presidency, South Korea might catch a chance to be the negotiator again, since Biden more stressed the power and role of alliance than Trump. And I do remember Biden talks about the nuclear free zone in Korean Peninsula.
Kyung-soo, let me ask to have you stop there. We'll have plenty of time to come back, but if it's all right.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a very long story, and I want to.
No. You you went beyond your duty and gave us insights into both North Korean motivation and the role of South Korea. We'll come back to your ideas about the role of the United States, but I want to make sure we can have a conversation here. So I want to turn next to Do-yeon Kim. I apologize for the oversight. I assume people have seen the bios, so I didn't do a proper introduction of Dr. Lee. Kyung-soo is a senior fellow at Seoul National University Institute of Peace and Unification. And next, we're going to turn to Do-yeon Kim, who's an adjunct senior fellow at the Center for New American Security. And Do-yeon, I think the question for you to get us started is, maybe you could continue right where Kyung-soo left off and talk a bit about Washington, if this is primarily in terms of a peace negotiation, which is of course also a denuclearization negotiation at some level, or disarmament. There's both the roles of those two primary parties who you watch closely, but also of the other stakeholders and potentially, as Kyung-soo was mentioning, mediators, the role of both South Korea and China. And so I wonder if you could give us a kind of regional perspective as well as some insights into the role of the United States going forward in a peace resolution approach. So Do-yeon.
Well, thanks so much, John and Yonsei University and the Nordic Embassies in Seoul, South Korea, for having me share some views with this very distinguished panel. I guess in a very brief snapshot, because we have 5 minutes each, what we know of President-elect Joe Biden's North Korea policy or approach basically is what we have heard him and Anthony Blinken say in public. And I want to be careful not to speculate details, because I'd imagine their policy is still being formulated and they'd want to have enough options on the table to choose from, because diplomacy is fluid and international relations is fluid. But what we do know is what President-elect Biden had said during the campaign, and I think these are very important signs and clues. One, he said his goal is a denuclearized North Korea, including the prevention of the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And he stressed also in his op-ed to Yonhap News Agency after his election that his approach will really be underpinned by principled diplomacy in coordination with American allies and partners, including China. And that is key. That's going to be quite different from the Trump approach and more going back to the traditional American foreign policy approach. He also said that they would need to set the right formula for sanctions enforcement and relief. And what is also important is that he said that he's willing to meet with Kim Jong-un if Kim Jong-un agrees to draw down his nuclear capacity. So, and we also know that President-elect Biden will bring process back to foreign policy making and international relations. And so, I think what is important for us to think about as we see him put his people in place, as we see his policy pan out, and I think it's important that all stakeholders, especially North Korea, who we have seen likes to provoke and test weapons during a presidential year or after an election, I think it's important that all stakeholders stakeholders kind of wait and see how the new American administration builds its team and how its policy pans out, and that will take a few weeks and months. But in the immediate and near term, I see some challenges to advancing denuclearization and peace, and I'll just go through three very briefly. One is resuming negotiations between the US and North Korea, of course, because those are the key players, but also involving the other four countries, South Korea, China, Japan, and even Russia. And so the question is on how and when to resume negotiations. Who will make the first move? Will we see again probably the typical provocation cycles and then engagement, or will we see either the U.S. or North Korea extend their hand first and seek dialogue first? And the other question with resuming negotiation is on format. Will we, I think it's safe to assume, of course, based on what we've been hearing, is a Biden administration will want to go back to the traditional process and working level negotiations before any summit is to take place. But we've also seen that North Korea, at least during the Trump administration, prefers symmetry. And so those are big questions. The second is on sequencing. So if diplomatic negotiations actually take place and resume, it's sequencing between denuclearization and the peace process. We know that North Korea and South Korea's Moon Jae-in administration, they both want to drive the peace process, put more energy there first. And we've seen this, Dr. Lee mentioned, the Singapore statement. North Korea, the order in which North Korea wants to negotiate with the United States is first new relations, and then peace, and then finally denuclearization. It's the first time in history, in all these agreements, that North Korea got its way in the order, in the sequence in which it wants to negotiate. On the other hand, the United States typically, across all political parties in the US, typically prefers denuclearization first and then peace. And the American approach really has been to negotiate and use tools and tactics to change North Korea's behavior. Of course, there are ways to do this in tandem, do denuclearization and peace, talk about them in tandem simultaneously, but traditionally, American and South Korean conservative governments have wanted to see, more progress or enough denuclearization steps first before some official push to go the peace route, because the concern here has always been, their concern has always been that denuclearization negotiations could fall hostage to peace negotiations if they worked in tandem at the same time, if they started at the same time. Finally, the big question is, where would on many people's minds, experts and observers, is where will the North Korean nuclear issue fare on President Biden's agenda, on the American presidential agenda? And there's a lot of concern in South Korea and also in many circles in Washington outside of government, concern that, as important as, of course, the US-China strategic competition is, and we need to deal with that, as important as it is, there's concern that the North Korean nuclear issue will be overshadowed by the US-China rivalry. There's concern that, because of that, political attention and presidential attention will be less, and that there would not be enough political impetus to proactively gain traction on both, whether it's denuclearization and peace, or both on a practical front. And so I think this is a big question and something we'll have to keep our eyes on. And of course, we can safely assume that many of the stakeholder countries and also stakeholders in terms of groups within each countries will try to inject their ideas and their thoughts and try to persuade their state leaders to put more political capital and attention on the North Korea issue. Thanks, John.
Great. Well, thank you, Dooyeon, and thanks for sticking to time. I think it's your earlier training as a journalist who has to work on deadline, but you packed a lot of insight into that, as always. We're going to shift gears a little bit now and go from the academics and observers to, I suppose we could say, the activists, because we thought that would be an interesting mixture, both those who are watching things and those who are in a more direct way trying to do things. And I think also our next two presenters will build really nicely on a point that Berit Reiss-Andersen made about you know, the peace process has the kind of high level of dialogue and the governmental role that we've been talking about, but without support of publics, of institutions, it may not be sustainable. It may not stick. And I think we can agree that that is one problem with efforts at the Korean peace. And so I want to start with you. Mimi Han is the vice president of the World wide WCA and Korean Women's Movement for Peace. You are an actor in this incredibly dynamic world of civil society here. It's one of the great things about living in South Korea, I can say as a foreigner, but also that has global linkages with other civil society, especially around, I think, advancing agendas of peace, of pacifism, also humanitarianism and feminism. And so I wonder if you could talk a bit about your perspective, specifically in terms of what is the role for citizens? What role do citizens play in peacemaking and peace building here in terms of the Korean conflict? So if I could turn it to you.
Great, thank you. First is warm greetings from Seoul, and thank you for Swedish government to hosting this event.
And the Nordics, all the Nordics.
Nordics, I'm sorry, it's all the Nordics. Okay, thank you. I'm gonna go straight ahead because we have such a limited time, about 5 minutes. I'm gonna try to answer as much as I can the question you asked. The progress of inter-Korean relations have been quite limited by the constantly changing political climates, we know, and both at home and abroad. The political parties and new administration comes in every 4 years or 8 years in the United States, for example, 5 years in Korea. This domestically, internationally, the new parties and new administration comes in, the Korean peace process has been subjected to these frequent changes. This type of the unpredictable political environment, plus, as you all know, that officially Korean War is not ended. So with that circumstances truly increases the instability of the Korean Peninsula. For example, under the Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun, which is about 1998 to 2008, South Korea promoted sunshine policies to fostering the inter-Korean dialogues and exchanges. However, after Lee Myung-bak and the Park Geun-hye administration, the policy almost entirely reversed and leading to, as you know, the closure of the critical cross-country initiatives such as Kaesong Industry Complex in 2016. So I see the civil society role to be especially critical in this context. Civil society serve as a consistently and constant force that helps push the peace process forward in this middle of the political transitions. Further, civil society helped to advocate for the continuity in a critical policies such as providing humanitarian assistance to vulnerable communities. For example, as I'm representing the national and the worldwide WCA, we are one of the first initiator to support the baby powders in mid-1990s until now to North Korea to help and reduce child malnutrition. And beyond providing many basic food supplies and medications, many other organizations have also been assisting with the building the medical infrastructures of North Korea, including medical centers for TB patients. And I can go on with different things, but because we have limited time, I'm just gonna be going to the next, is that these humanitarian assistance not only helps to reduce the immediate hunger and diseases in North Korea, but it also builds a critical foundation for peace process by first one is helping to build trust with the North Korean communities. And number two, investing the next generation of peace unification New Korea, as many of these programs are targeted towards the children and youth. Just a second. And to close, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, because I think it tells me that I'm running out of the batteries. So I'm going to be.
Oh, okay.
Go.
You're
No,
fine.
it's okay. Yeah, I'm fine. Good. To close, I do believe that civil society role to be distinct, but often complementary to the role of government. Until now, critical international issues has often been tackled down to top to bottom manner and vertically. Many decisions are driven at the top level of the government without inclusions or representative of the civil society, especially women. And civil societies and actors are trying hard to shift this type of the paradigm to collaboratively and inclusively process that works every levels, in local levels, national levels, and global levels. And starting that, I believe that beginning at the grassroots level, through the people to exchange, to the older level, to the top bilateral negotiation. So I'm a dreamer. That's obviously that's what helps me to push for being an activist and advocator. It's like growing a tree. Tree cannot grow from top to bottom. I truly believe that it has to be starting from together, bottom to up. And this is the true sustainable peace building process, I believe. And that's what key roles that civil society is going to play together. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Vice President Han. That's very interesting and refreshing perspective, but also a persistent and determined one to make progress. I want to turn now and get another, as you say, Mimi, a bottom-up view on peace, and hear what Joanna, my colleague, Joanna Hosaniak, who teaches sometimes here at Yonsei, but is Deputy Director General of the Citizens Alliance for North Korean Human Rights. We thought it was very important to include you in the conversation because often it seems that the discussion of peace and conflict resolution and mediation in a Korean Peninsula context doesn't emphasize human rights, and vice versa. Sometimes the human rights discussion doesn't talk about peace. And so we're hoping that you can help us and give insight into how you understand the relationship between peace, promoting a peace agenda, and justice, promoting justice, which is, of course, in a classical definition of peace, included in the meaning of peace is justice. So I wonder if you could share some of your reflections on how you look at these issues. So, Joanna.
Thank you, Professor Deluri, and thank you to Swedish Embassy and all the Nordic countries for organizing this event and inviting me to this distinguished panel. I would like to kind of circle back to what Chairperson Andersen mentioned in the beginning with relation to the Nobel Peace Prize, and to kind of close with her thoughts. I would like to start with a story. Let's go back a century before, and a story of a woman who actually inspired Nobel Peace Prize. She's not taught usually in the textbooks, and students do not know about her. Bertha von Suttner, who was a prominent activist in a peace movement and women's rights movement. And think about it, 19th century, majority of women did not have yet women's rights and right to vote and right to participate and influence the decision of the political leaders. And they viewed that as a primary obstacle to prevent the wars and also to participate meaningfully in the processes of peace building and development, simply because the women were primary victims, usually women and children, of the war conflicts and different conflicts, and they were also excluded from subsequent processes. And so, unfortunately, the story of women at that time, the Hague peace processes, 19th century and early 20th century, the story of Bertha did not prevent the First World War and the kind of peace talks in Paris and the peace treaty did not prevent the atrocity of the Second World War. And the one, I think, important lesson to kind of look back from the 1919 Paris in the 1919 is that the peace is not something that can be imposed on the conference table, because it just grows from the hearts of the people. And this women's fighting for women's rights and peace at that time reminds us about one yet another lesson that we see over and over again in many countries around the world, that women are not participating in meaningful processes when building peace and also in the processes of development. And this I would like to, with this I would like to link to the situation on the Korean Peninsula, because yes, the initiatives by the leaders are important. However, the initiatives and the peace talks and K-pop going to Pyongyang will not affect women or in general population on the ground. And without this participation of people, and participation is a key issue in terms of realization of all types of human rights, then we cannot talk about the durable peace process. And in terms of North Korea, we are here talking about the decades of violations, especially systematic discrimination, going back 3 generations of someone's ancestors and the perceived loyalty to the regime, which affects everything from right to food, to health, to education, to residence, to job. And also unresolved issues that are affecting South Korean society, unresolved issues of separated families and not discussed these days the unresolved issue of thousands, over 100,000 of civilians that were abducted during Korean War and post-war, in the post-war period, and the unresolved issue of South Korean prisoners of war. Issues such as violence and discrimination against women, to just name the few. And so women in North Korea were primary driving force behind the development. They are the ones, when the state collapsed, they are the ones that really enabled the development of the black market system. They were the ones that were actually forced to take care of their families. This is a kind of secondary way how North Korean women are also discriminated against. They are supposed to take care of the family, and they are viewed good as far as they can earn money on the markets, not as someone who is valuable, who can be educated, and who can, for example, take part and influence important decision-making in the country. This is also how the state is abusing and using women for various projects, including military projects, because women earn money on the market. They also have to submit enormous quota of money that sponsor what North Korean government is developing, including militarily. And so, you know, when we discuss this, issues of resolving conflict on the Korean Peninsula, a lot of North Koreans that have come to South Korea, escaped to South Korea since then, they of course knew about these processes in North Korea. However, they had no idea what they would entail and how they could participate in them. And this is one of the reasons why many North Koreans, and including North Korean human rights civil society, view these processes as a very artificial force without really full participation from the civil society and from the people that will be directly affected by peace processes and development processes. These inter-Korean projects that may, you know, involve, for example, how to prevent women's forced labor or children's forced labor or prisoners' forced labor, or on inter-Korean projects. This kind of discussion is not or is not happening with the civil society. Yes, civil society has sent several letters. We have over 200 organizations around the world have sent several letters to President Moon Jae-in and asked for negotiations with relation to the summit and what will happen after. They are unanswered. And I will finish here to open the floor for further discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Joanna. I'm very impressed that maybe even pleasantly surprised that activists are keeping to the time limits as well. It really shows the academics. Kyung-Soo, you and I got to do better. But so I think we can move now into a more interactive session, and also we're getting questions on the YouTube chat. And again, I want to encourage everybody who's watching this to please send your questions in, and we will include as much of those as we can. But let me get a kind of second quick round started by thinking, in a way, I hear we're almost having two conversations that link nicely together. And since this is Nordic sponsorship, I think it's appropriate to bring in the pioneer of peace research, Johan Galtung, the Norwegian scholar who talked about peace as positive and negative. And so in a way, I think Kyung-Soo and Dooyeon are focusing on negative peace, meaning no war, and ideally no nuclear weapons, and the problems of balancing maybe those two goals, but which is also kind of the discussion around security, which is of course a form of peace. And then Mimi and Joanna are talking about positive peace. You know, peace is something that means more than just not killing each other, but it means a connectedness between all Koreans on the peninsula. And it also means a relief of suffering, especially in North Korea, and basic rights on the whole spectrum of rights to North Koreans in particular, as Joanna discussed, the most vulnerable, weakest members of society, including women and children. So if we think about that large framework, maybe we could start, and I could ask both Kyung-Soo and Dooyeon in talking about, you know, negative peace. I wanted to bring in something that you touched on, but that Barrett stressed, which is the role of institutions, and again, kind of a broader supporting structure. And so what I'd like to hear your views on is, you know, if we're going to make some practical progress toward negative peace, making this region more secure, and hopefully even getting rid of some of the capabilities, what do you both think is the right structure for that? You know, who are the players at the table? And this is something I know both of you have studied a lot. Given your assessments, and I guess especially the two Koreas in the United States, but also China. We haven't talked too much about China, and also the United Nations. You know, what's the role of the UN Security Council and multilateralism? So there's a lot of room there, but Dooyeon, maybe we could start with you, and then Kyung-Soo, hear from you on that question.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really great question. I think, you know, I think the basic elements in the broad contours of a more comprehensive approach to the North or the Korean Peninsula problem has always been there, and they've always been included in past agreements that have been negotiated with North Korea. I think it's just with this Trump administration, a lot of that got lost in the bilateral process that we saw. And a lot of that got lost because they weren't able to get to that stage of talking about, you know, the positive piece, and talking about, you know, things like, you know, South Korean POWs, human rights. You know, human rights has always been part of the mix in these negotiations in the context of, especially during the six-party talks, in the context of US, North Korea normalization, normalizing their relations. I mean, the human rights has always been, from Washington's perspective, going to be included in that discussion. You've got things like Japanese abductee issue, you know, that was supposed to be part of the North Korea-Japan normalization process. And so, you know, I think the challenge right now, you know, as I mentioned before, is trying to get these negotiations back on track and to get them going. And of course, the key players I think that should still be at the table are all six countries, because you know, the North Korean nuclear issue, it's not just a purely nuclear problem. It's, you know, it's a regional problem, and there are regional issues that have nothing to do with nuclear weapons that are all intertwined into the nuclear issue, and they all impact and affect each other and affect the relations among all six countries in the region. And so I personally would like to see a process where all six countries and stakeholders can be included in, I mean, it doesn't have to be a rigid six-party framework. I mean, it doesn't have to be, but more of a formal process to bring in these voices and to talk about non-nuclear issues that also impact and affect the nuclear issue.
Okay, great, thank you. Kyung-Soo, your thoughts, and let me also bring in a specific question. There are a number actually that are relevant to this discussion, but one question is, will Biden, of course, everyone wants to know that, will Biden take the reins on North Korea, or will he be open to the possibility of cooperation resuming between the North and South? And this is a good way to phrase it, and give Seoul more maneuverability. So I wonder if you could try to answer that as well, along with your thoughts on this issue of who's at the table and how much multilateralism.
I see. Under the Trump, bilateral talks were overwhelmingly at the focus, but even at that time, I remember China and Russia talks about coming back to the six-party talks, because China and Russia wanted to kind of institutionalize platform that they can partake in. I do remember it, but in talks about multilateralism, the current player is North and South Korea and United States, and possibly China, because North Korea, Kim Jong-un visited China, have several rounds of summit with China during and in between those United States and South Korean summit. And I think current players are North and South Korea and two superpowers, but I'm not quite sure, considering the United States US rivalry, there will be a kind of institutionalized platform for both four. And in that sense, six-party talks that enlarge the regional, talks about the regional issues, as well as the denuclearization and new relations might be an option for our talks. And you talked about the UN Security Council. I remember. I also think that the role of UN General Council's resolution during the suspension of warlike behaviors during the Pyeongchang Olympic was a really important point. The South Korean government proposed UN General Council to have a kind of resolution for suspension of military, suspension of hostile act during the Pyeongchang Olympic times. And South Korea, North Korea, and all the United States, UN countries like that ideas, and they voted for the idea and make the resolution. It is kind of UN, law of UN Security Council, not only Security Council, but also UN General Council in the peace process. And again, what's your talks about the South Korea's room for maneuvering?
Yeah, under a Biden dynamic.
Yeah. Biden. Also, I know it's too soon to talk about future prospect, and I'm not a kind of fortune teller, but I do think that traditionally, Biden could prefer multilateralism and cooperation with South Korean government as an alliance. So South Korean Moon Jae-in might face the real challenge for impacting those peace process in this important critical juncture, like 2 years ago. Maybe after 6 or 7 months later, after the Biden has fully set up his foreign policy, including Korean Peninsula.
Great, thank you. Dooyeon, let me, while we're on this theme, and I've got some great questions, let me just fuse a couple and ask you one follow-up, which is, so both of you seem, paraphrasing, kind of relieved the bilateralism era, maybe over that one, but not sure where we go next, and some openness to six-party talks, but not exactly that exact same structure. But there are questions about other actors beyond the UN, and specifically, do you have any thoughts on the role of the EU or even Nordic countries? And yeah, so I wonder if you could just comment on that. And then also a related question is specific forms of international cooperation that you think could be helpful in moving us forward from where we are now?
Oh,
So
yeah.
yeah, I get this. I got this question a lot throughout the Trump administration years from European ambassadors and officials in Brussels. You know, I think theoretically it'd be great to have European actors involved, but practically, I think the practical reality and the practical political reality is that none of the 6 parties in the region would see a concrete rationale for having an actor or a country outside the region be at the table, the negotiating table for future agreements, multilateral agreements with North Korea on the nuclear issue and other outstanding regional issues. And I think it's just simply just because, other countries outside the region just are not well versed in the culture, the history, the politics, and they don't know the region and the countries as well as those in the region that have lived with North Korea all these centuries or decades. And so I think that's one, and I think that's been the main hesitation for the stakeholders in Northeast Asia to include European. But I have always said that when an actual nuclear agreement is being implemented, I think practically there, and we've seen this in the past too, you've got renowned, top-notch nuclear experts in Europe who can help with the actual, dismantlement process and, the implementation of these agreements on the ground. And I think that's where a lot of European expertise can definitely contribute and be very useful, especially on the nuclear dismantlement side. But I am very well aware that the hesitation or opposition from European countries there on that point is they don't want to be the piggy bank. They don't just want to, have to offer money and assistance with no voice at the table. So I understand that dynamic. I understand that, from a European perspective, like the JCPOA approach makes sense to them. Or like a Helsinki process type where, where SACOM might be a mediator or venue sponsor, but I think it's a bit unfamiliar and less natural for Northeast Asian countries to think along those lines when it comes to negotiating the actual agreements.
Thank you, Dooyeon. At this moment, I wonder, since we're talking things Nordic and the general international view, if Berit Reiss Andersen, if you wanted to come back in, you'd certainly be welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I've been listening to your discussion with great interest. And of course, you underline a very important point that it is in the region, the knowledge and the experience of this particular conflict is. And I believe it is in the region and with the traditional means, even though the 6 parties are not only in the region, but you have to stick to this local framework. Outsiders might be able to facilitate. We have seen that as a global trend. And what I really wanted to convey, formal peace treaties are not really how peace is settled in our day and age. And I would like to thank Joanna for mentioning Berta von Suttner as a symbol of civil society and actually also a symbol of feminism contributing to peace, because there is a divide there. Masculinity has been to politicians and warfare and femininity to the opposition. And the history of Berta von Suttner is that it was one of the first platforms where women became politically active. Now, what I want to say is that civil society plays an enormous role in these processes. We have learned from history that peace comes like a bursting force through even the most suppressing structures. And the problem is, of course, that in North Korea, you have no civil society. And it is, to put it mildly, a difficult communication between your divided nations. I believe institutions can be of support even here. Perhaps, you know, fantastic if the Security Council could make a contribution, but it's really the down-to-earth agencies that can be very important. This year's recipient of the Peace Prize is the World Food Programme. They are one of the few institutions who managed to deliver also into North Korea. And as it was mentioned in the discussion, the importance of creating goodwill by meeting people's basic needs cannot be underestimated. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that intervention. Also, I feel like I don't have to do anything here. My job's just being done for me. That's the perfect segue to go back to Mimi and Joanna, because of course they represent on the ground in South Korea two forms of that civil society that precisely you're talking about. And also it links to some great questions from the chat. The first one is really directed at you, Mimi, which is, again, building just on that point. I think there's curiosity to understand, how does a South Korean civil society organization engage in a place with essentially no civil society, or something that's very hard to recognize as such? What are the unique challenges that you face, and how do you find ways to overcome those challenges?
Okay, just first to answer your question right away, yes, it is again, political climate really do impact and influences our civil society's support or communications dialogue with North Korea, inter-Korean relations. However, we have used this platform with the global partnerships, such as ecumenical platforms for the Nobel Women Initiatives, WILF, you know, the UN Women Cross DMZ. This global networking plus the faith community has been providing this platform for the inter-Korean relations dialogue. And for example, WCC, World Council of Christian, you know, the church, they've been providing more than 30 years. And this channel has been not closed. It's been always continuing this, surprisingly, with or without this political climate changes. So this is one of the platforms that I also very strongly partner with, YMCA, YWCA, in all the denominations of, you know, the church ecumenical movement. Another, I told you about the women, feminist leaderships and activists, the peace activists. That's what happened in 2015. This 30 global women activists actually walked through the North to South Korea in 2015. And it really made that statement. But this did not happen. As I told you before, a lot of people remember that first the civilian to walk across the DMZ is in 1998. The Hyundai, the president of the Hyundai walked with a cow, you know, the thousands of cows, but it's not. 1991, woman is the first civilian who walked across the North Korean woman, South Korean woman, Japanese woman actually walked. And then that for 1991 to 1993, they went to Pyongyang, Seoul, Tokyo, again Seoul. There was actually the dialogue, and there was the platform that there was for the civil society, especially for women who initiate this peace. And then I can go on to the last year when we did a public diplomacy going into the Capitol Hill. The women activists, the civil society from Korea, and plus 3 congresswomen from the Korean government, and meeting Democrat women, and including the president candidate Bernie Sanders and other 2 candidates. We got to meet them and to talk, non-partisan talk about peace. The people, citizen people of Korea, we don't want war. Period. That's definitely not the option that we obviously have in the table. In order to have this peace, well, we need the global support, especially even top level and civil society. And this is what we've done. And actually, tangible result came out. The House Resolution 152, the Rokana from the California actually made that resolution, and the 52 until the September 52 Congress people signed it, and amazing. Last one was the Republican signed it. It was not only Democrat. One of the Republican signed this. I think his name was Andy Biggs. Biggs. So he signed it. So now Rokana, as the re-elected as a House representative, he's going to be reintroducing this resolution very strongly to the Biden, and he's going to be advising. That's what he said publicly in the interview. So this is like writing the draft and convincing them, mobilizing the Korean American voters, the communities to really push that. And that happened together with a woman leaderships who really did that. And then often we get overshadowed by it. Maybe we are too humble, but I mean, yes. So I'm proudly mentioned this. It's not just bring awareness or raising voices, but we are putting in action. It's coming out from, showing it as a result too.
Thank you very much for that. I feel like this is the point when you're cooking dinner and you got 3 pots and they're all ready but about to burn and the kids are screaming, and there's so much that's fascinating stuff on the table. So one thing I want to remind us, I'd like to come back again to Dooyeon and Kyung-soo, is building on Mimi's point about some of her work and what's going on with HR 152, but also the end of war declaration, which is such a big push here politically in South Korea, but there's a lot of debate, and you brought it up. But using those two as examples, but if we could come back to you guys in a second to think about specific modalities of how to move a peace agenda forward in a meaningful way, not in a just symbolic, superficial way, but in a real way. So I'd like to come back to you. But before that, Joanna, there's questions for you. And of course, important ways in which you can intervene in this discussion. And one question, it's really just another version of what we're talking about from the perspective. The specific question from the chat is when you mentioned there are civil society groups that have petitioned to the Blue House, to the President Moon here. There was a question about specifically what are the requests for, what is the agenda there? If you could elaborate, but I think also just if you could weigh in more broadly about this question of how do you and your group and other related human rights groups, how do you all wrestle with the problem of not having a civil society on the other end, and what are the theories of change and to make progress in terms of positive peace? If you could share some of your views on that.
Yes, thank you. I would like to link to what Chair Anderson mentioned is a very valuable point about the civil society. Then, a century ago and now, without civil society, you cannot really build peace. And the problem of building peace with North Korea is the fact that we do not have, as Ms. Anderson mentioned, counterparts on the ground. And even the humanitarian assistance counterparts are really governmental organizations, the North Korean government organizations that control these entities. The women, they cannot mobilize themselves in any type of associations. Even if they like cats or dogs, they cannot have this kind of associations on the ground. This is all channeled through Korea Democratic Women's Union, and it's all controlled by the government. Under such circumstances, you have to really reflect the voices that you know of from the ground, and people who are decision makers have to listen to the people who bring these stories. And Chair Anderson was mentioning in the end about the victims, how important role are the victims are playing in these processes. And thus far, we had no initiatives where the South Korean government would follow up to what was recognized by the United Nations Commission of Inquiry and many EU and countries, all of them, and the US and majority countries around the world when adopting the resolution, calling for referral of North Korean leadership to International Criminal Court, but also to create a form of peace and truth building processes that would listen to the victims on the ground. And this was actually what was included in the letter to President Moon, because South Korea was part of these processes at the UN with the North Korean Human Rights Resolution, when Commission of Inquiry was established, with the report and the adoption of the recommendations of the Commission of Inquiry. But even putting that aside, both South Korea and North Korea have ratified basic human rights treaties voluntarily. And so South Korea, could naturally play important role to follow up on these recommendations that North Korean government have been issued at the UN level, whether this was CEDAW committee monitoring the discrimination against women in North Korea, Child Rights Committee, or whether this is Universal Periodic Review. All of them have hundreds of recommendations, and many of them were accepted by the North Korean government. How about following up on that to make incremental changes on the ground? Because yes, humanitarian assistance is important. However, the reality on the ground is that majority of people rely on black markets, on capitalist black markets. They do not rely on humanitarian assistance. And they are the ones that are the driving force of the development, but they are the ones that are also driving a lot of infrastructure projects, and they are forced to drive these infrastructure projects by the North Korean government. This is forced labor, this is provision of bricks, this is provision of sand, this is where women, children, and prisoners are involved in all of these projects. In order to meaningfully follow up, to have impact on this population, we would have to have this follow-up from the South Korean government, I think. And this is one of the reasons, what we included in the letter. Another one, and very important one, I think, to show the meaningful exchanges between the people is, again, what I'm saying is not Mickey Mouse going to Pyongyang or K-pop going to Pyongyang. Yes, it is important, but this is important only and will have impact on the elites. It does not have impact on the people on the ground. And the meaningful, I think, processes would be, first of all, millions of people are still waiting, to have some meaningful contact with people that are on the other side of the border. The issue of separated families. It has to be unconditionally resolved so that these people have unconditional access to at least communicate with each other, because they are so advanced in age. Secondly, the issue of South Korean prisoners of war. I remember when one prisoner of war once told me, who escaped later after 2002 from North Korea, he said, they were waiting and they saw President Kim Dae-jung and Kim Jong-il shaking hands, and they hoped that the issue will be raised at the table. And then yet they realized that again, the issue was not raised, and this is up for them to come back, to escape the country and come back to South Korea, because they will not see their country and their families before death. This is another issue, the issue of prisoners of war. South Korean abductions, right? And their families. Still, a lot of women and a lot of families are waiting for their loved ones that are on the other side of the border. The checking of their whereabouts and well-being would be this meaningful step, I think, building and drawing people together.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're getting very close to the finish line here. I want to give a chance for maybe just a last lightning round. Maybe if each of you could really just take a minute for any strands that you wanted to pick up and any questions that were there unanswered. And one, I'll just mention, we've done this whole discussion. As an American, I was relieved the word Trump was only mentioned once. Interestingly, no one's mentioned COVID or the pandemic, which is why we're talking through computers. But there is a lot of thinking about public health and its relationship with peace, and whether that in the near term is an avenue for progress in both on a humanitarian side, but potentially on a political side. So if there are any closing thoughts, I'd like to ask for a last 1 minute each round, if that's okay, and then we'll have to conclude. So let's see, Kyung-soo, could I start with you? We'll go in the original order. And about Ray Sanderson, you'd be very welcome as well to join. So Kyung-soo, start with you.
I will keep it simple. In terms of, because it is convened by Nordic countries, and when I think of Nordic countries' engagement with Korean Peninsula, I first think about humanitarian assistance and ongoing focus on international development focus. As seen in the SIDA, it is still under the sanction regime. SIDA is still and working in North Korea, making a change in North Korea and ordinary peoples. So I hope that besides this political and negative peace process, I do hope Korean activists and experts like me could collaborate with Nordic countries' experts and citizens, work on how to make real changes. They are making real changes very slowly, so making real changes in North Korea. Yeah, it's my hope, and thank you very much for inviting me this valuable opportunity.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you for that. Okay, Duyan, any last thoughts?
Actually, I'll answer your other question because I think it's an important one. And there are many people who ask, well, why can't we go the peace route first to try to solve the nuclear issue? And these are all very valid and important questions. And I think it's also important to really dig deep and analyze the different factors that are involved. You know, if we try the peace route, because of the level of sophistication of North Korea's nuclear weapons program and the fact that they actually have nuclear weapons, the overarching question is, you know, does it make sense for the United States to make peace with a nuclear armed North Korea? And here there, you know, especially when UN Security Council resolutions say that North Korea is not allowed to have nuclear weapons or technology and materials. And so that's one overarching question we have to discuss. At the same time, you know, it seems like North Korea, they talk and act as if they want to make peace with the United States as a nuclear power. And so that's a fundamental issue or stumbling block and sticking point. But even if we wanted to try the peace route first, you know, there is precedent. In 97 to 99, there was the so-called four-party talks between the two Koreas, the US and China, that actually tried the peace regime route first to try to solve the nuclear issue. And they broke it down. They met 6 times, but they broke down and they couldn't do it for precisely these types of reasons. And so, you know, an end of war declaration, that's something that, you know, the Moon government has wants and it, still wants, and they have wanted it since the key players now in the Moon government have wanted it since the Roh Moo-hyun administration back then. Here, you know, John, you ask a very important question of how do you do this not symbolically but substantively, and there are a lot of legal issues because of the armistice. What do you say about the armistice? What do you say about U.S. troops? And so it's very complex and very complicated, and of course it's a topic for another webinar. But you know, I think we need to really game these issues out, talk these issues out, think about them, and if there really is a happy balance in pursuing both denuclearization and peace, I mean, I'm all for it. But I feel like I know that the nuclear issue always gets in that way of the sequencing issue.
Great, thank you, Duyan. If our audience can bear with us, we're going to go just slightly over time to get 1 minute each. So yes, Mimi, please.
For me, the civil society should have this independent system and space so that you will not be conditioned to the political climate. You know, it's not top tiers decision making. So we need to have that definitely independent platform. And number 2 is you mentioned it just at the end of it, that we really do redefining the meaning of the security. Feminists have always been talking about the human security. We need to see this as a more holistic way. It's not just absence of the weapons or the armies or the conflict equals to peace. We need to see this more bigger pictures, especially COVID-19. We see this. It's another war, another conflict that we are facing. And then most of the vulnerable communities, especially women and children, are the most victim. When we look at that, we really need to at civil society and government level, we really need to push that, redefining the securities, and then really go to next steps. Another one I really like to mention is I told you how important is providing platform through the ecumenical fields and then other global partners, and including Nordic countries. Swedish government was willing to provide the venues and facilitate and meditating between North and South Korea beginning of this year. Unfortunately, because of the COVID-19, it didn't happen. So it's not just providing the space, but it is actually help them to build that relationship together. So, I like to end with, team is always, together we achieve more. That's the true meaning of TEAM. And then this is how we are. It's not just the civil society or government. That's what all we are here for. So that's what I like to end. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those wise observations. Joanna, a final comment.
Thank you, John. I would like to kind of refer to what Professor Deluri asked about impact of COVID-19, and that we didn't mention that. I think this is key issue right now, because we are freely talking and yet nobody from North Korea can join this conversation. And one thing is that because people so rely on the black markets, and they cannot really have free access to health infrastructure in North Korea without provision of money and different materials, bringing them to hospitals and so on. The fact that the borders are closed means that there are no goods on the market. And this is what we hear from North Korea these days, however limited this information is. And yet people cannot also escape the country because it has been fortified and there is an order to shoot at people who will escape. And so in such situation, people are like proverbial sardines in the can. Neither can escape, nor they can somehow find, means for subsistence in their own country. This situation only exacerbated the human rights conditions in North Korea that were not addressed before. And I think about it, when you go to Geneva, in front of the UN, there is a chair. It stands on 3 legs, and one leg, the 4th leg, is broken. And I think that, human rights, so this whole peace process, without upholding human rights as a tool for peace building process on the Korean Peninsula, is like that chair. The balance will tip at some point, and the chair will collapse in the future.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's a powerful image. Do you have a final comment you'd like to share, Grace Anderson?
Well, thank you very much. I just think this has been such an extraordinary, interesting session, and thank you all for sharing all this knowledge with me from the region. And what I realize even more is the complexity of this issue. It has a traditional peace negotiating side, as there is an unsettled conflict, the nuclear issue. But I'm also very happy that you all have highlighted exactly the health issues, famine that has been part of this warfare through 70 years and still is, and the basic problem of human rights. It is difficult for us in Europe to have the adequate information, to have the proper insight in the conflict. I would just encourage you all, keep us informed. And when it comes particularly to the Peace Prize, you are academics who have participated here. Most of you probably have the right to nominate players in the peace process. So I will just close by directing you to our website, nobelpeaceprize.org. You will get all the relevant information. We need your information and support. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. That's a good link to get at the end. And I would echo all of that in my thanks to all of you, to our panel and to our distinguished guest from Norway. I learned so much from this discussion. I don't know where to start, but one thing I would highlight, which I didn't know I would learn, is this kind of hidden feminist history in terms of peacemaking. And that is, I think, something that also merits its own webinar. So I'd look forward to attending that and learning more on that issue. I think we all want to thank, well, hopefully you'll join me in thanking my students here at Yonsei University, GSIS, who worked hard to make this possible. Even more so the Nordic Embassies based here in Seoul, Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Sweden, all of whom actually this is years in the making. This started with Nordic diplomats who happened to be women years ago thinking of a discussion like this. And even though they've moved on through their ministries to other places in good Nordic spirit, others joined in and everyone worked together and made this possible. We're so happy. And so the last thing is I want to thank you out there, the audience, but more than an audience, you were so participative. We received more questions than we could answer, but I tried to get a lot of them in there. And we hope that you will continue to be engaged on these issues, maybe share links to the recording of this in your networks, and so that we can continue to study, to act, to make progress toward peace and justice. So thank you very much to everyone for today's event. Thank you.